But but I also was um, I was talking to people about over the last couple of days about things going on in Israel and everything kind of dovetailing together. But yeah, um, yeah, I'm we're we're starting to think about Purim. You know, we're getting in the mindset of Purim because Purim's like 7 weeks away. And if you want to help out and be part of Purim, let Wendy know. She mentioned it at services last Friday, um, a week ago or whatever so ago that she led services. But her, Rick, and Addie are all going to be helping to lead music again this year. But we're going through the through the spiel and through the story of Esther and looking at it and stuff like that. And I got to tell you, I mean, this year it's real hard to laugh at, you know, kill the Jews, it's real hard to go through it this year because of what is reality of the world we live in. So I have to say I was really uh um yeah, it doesn't feel like a time to laugh about it in a way, in a weird way. So it was weird. Yeah. So, many, many years ago, there was like Purim kind of intersected. There was a really bad um, terrorist attack in Israel at Purim. They had like attacked a Purim day with one of the bombings back in the late 90s, 2000s during the Intifada, which was a really bad time for Israel in a way. I mean, not as many people, died on one day, but over the course of a couple of years, there were a lot of Israelis that were dying. And it didn't happen one day. It just kept happening, sometimes twice in a week, sometimes two family members would be killed in a bus bomb, one day and one day, a few weeks later and another. Mm-hmm. And so it was really an ongoing problem, the Intifada. And people weren't going to Israel. And it was like, what could they do? And of course, that's why Israel built the security wall. But I remember one year I said about Purim that Purim teaches an important lesson. For Jews in the times where we're not under attack, it reminds us that it happens, and that we shouldn't forget that happens. And it happens at times when we least expect it sometimes, and also it's just a part of Jewish history that we can't forget. So never forget that this stuff happens. I said sometimes Purim teaches us that lesson in times where we're not thinking about it. In times that we're living it, it reminds us that our enemies will not win. And that's the other message of the holiday. So it's turning that fear, right? The fear of what Haman would have done, what he wanted to do, into something that we can laugh at and celebrate with joy, right? That it didn't happen. We stopped it. But when you're in the midst of it, it's really hard to think about. Like it's you have to remember that you're going to be okay. But it is really, really hard in the midst of it. And it's painful to think about it because it's just, who knows where we're going to be in 6 weeks from now. But right now, it still feels very much like, because when Haman says we're going to kill all the Jews, that's genocide. I mean, that's what genocide really is. I mean, people are now saying, accusing Israel of genocide, which is ridiculous. But when you say you're going to kill the Jews, I mean, Israel at no point of this war and no point in Israel's history has it ever attempted genocide over Arabs, over Palestinians, over Muslims. There's never been an attempt to liquidate the world or Israel or any place of Muslims or Arabs or Palestinians. But that's not the case It is not the case for us, which is one of the things that is so painful to hear while this is going on, that we're being accused of genocide when actually they were not successful, but they attempted. The goal of that attack was to kill every Jew that they could find. Didn't matter. It was not an act of war. It was an act of genocide. That's what genocide is. So what do you tell people who say, yeah, but thousands of kids have been killed in bombings and thousands of kids have been killed in Gaza. And the difference is that Israel has tried to minimize it, doesn't want them to die, doesn't want it on any level. So that's the difference, is Israel agonizes over the fact that innocent civilians are being killed. People ask me, well, it's 28,000. How much is enough? I said, one is too many. One innocent civilian in Gaza being killed is too many, but it's just not a reality right now when you're in the midst of war to do anything other than try to be as protective of civilians as you can, but recognize that this is a war. And it's a war that literally Israel is in the midst of. And I will tell you, people in Israel, on the right, on the left, every Israeli understands that. So Americans pretty much get it, but there are some who don't for some reason, and I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell them, because I can tell you that every day that this goes on, I am sad because I know there are innocent civilians are going to be killed, but I don't know what to tell you. That's why I wear this number, so that people will say to me, what's that number for? And I'll remind them, and I'll remind myself, this has been going on for 4 months. For over 4 months, people have been, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And it just gets me upset when I think about what 4 months means. Because those 14 and 15-year-old girls who've been raped and are now 4 months pregnant, I don't want to talk about it right now, because they're in a tunnel right now, pregnant. There's a nightmare happening right now. And so that's why Purim is a little hard for me this year, because it's a nightmare that's actually happening right now. So, I have some friends who are in Israel right now helping out. And so, I'm looking forward to taking our group, our kids there. And I hope that it's going to be safe. And I hope it's going to be, safe real soon for everybody. So let's turn back to Pirke Avot, to 2,000 years ago, when we were living in the land of Israel. And what we finished with last time is some of the text from chapter 3 that talked about how many people does it take to discuss Torah and for God to be amongst that group. And so we started out with, of course, with a minyan. Now, that's tough to get sometimes, but you don't even have to have a minyan. You can have 5. You could have 3. You could even have 1 or 2 or 1. Then it goes to 1. And the proof texts come from different parts of the Bible. And so this is an example of something that we see sometimes in Pirke Avot. We haven't seen it so much up till now, but we're going to see it more. And we see it throughout the Talmud, which is you prove your statement by quoting a part of the Bible. Sometimes it's from the Torah, from the 5 books, but sometimes it's from the prophets, like the prophet Amos or Malachi, and sometimes it's from Psalms. So that's what we've kind of finished with last time. Kind of tell you where we finished. The very last thing that we finished with, talked about other important ideas of studying. I know we read this one last time, which was not causing people to blush, not causing people to become embarrassed, not creating busha, embarrassment. I actually reminded somebody of that this week, actually. A couple of days ago, I told someone that they're causing embarrassment, and it's a sin. So we read that, which I think is an interesting thing to remind ourselves. It's right there, right?
What chapter is that? 312?
That's 311 is the one about not causing someone to blush in public. It actually says, it says in public, but yeah. And so that's kind of this is the last part that we read, this part from Rabbi Ishmael. Be suppliant, or again, pay honor to the head, to the one in charge. Be submissive, or again, take on the compulsory service, to be calm with that, and then greet every person with joy.
When I had a little.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's and so that's kind of, again, for a person living under the Roman era, you can kind of, the Roman rule, you can kind of understand why that was that was where he left with. So that was those last texts were from Rabbi Elazar. This was from Rabbi Ishmael. And today we're going to begin with Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva, yeah. Ooh. So this was from the time about 70 years after the temple was destroyed. There was another revolt against the Romans. There were a couple of revolts in the meantime, but there was one really big revolt during the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba led a Jewish general led a revolt against the Romans about 135. And so this takes place around then, which means it's about 2 generations before the Mishnah was finished. It's towards the end of that period. And the teachers of this era, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael, those people, we mentioned Rabbi Hanania ben Teradion last week, who was wrapped in a Torah and burned alive. Akiva, who had his skin ripped off of his living body. These guys were killed by the Romans, not just for teaching Torah, but also, it seems, advocating for political revolt to get the Romans out. And the Romans did, for a couple of years, suffer tremendous losses in Israel. So the revolt was successful for a couple of years. And eventually the Roman Emperor Hadrian, at the time, committed lots of troops to this battle, and they eventually destroyed Bar Kokhba, killed thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, maybe into the millions again. And that was the final break between Judaism and Christianity to some extent, because the Christians did not participate in that revolt. They sat that one out. There were other Jews who also sat that one out, who said that Bar Kokhba was not legitimate, was not going to be successful, and the best course of action was not to fight against the Romans. So there were rabbis who told Rabbi Akiva, don't do this. But he didn't listen to them, and he was killed. So this was a somewhat of an internal fight. The Jews were still at this time thinking, some of them, that they were going to rebuild the temple, that the Romans would change their mind, or maybe they had to be forced to change their mind, but we could rebuild the temple. Temple was not rebuilt during this time, even though Jews took control of parts of the country, including Jerusalem, the area around Jerusalem. But when the revolt was put down, finally, the leadership was further. That was pretty much the last revolt. It was pretty much the last revolt. But there was an entire Roman legion that disappeared. It's called the Lost Legion. They were wiped out. The Jewish rebels in that time wiped out a Roman legion. Thousands of Roman soldiers died there. So, yeah, it was a costly war for the Romans. And afterwards, the Romans said, they can never do this again. And they, one of the final acts that they did is they renamed the country Palestina after the Philistines. That was the final punishment. We're not going to call that area Judea anymore. We're not going to let the Jews have the name even anymore of their country, of their province. It will now be called Palestina. It was part of Syria. It was part of their state that was based in Syria, their region that was based there. But that district, that area was called Palestina. And that was the final insult to the Jews, is to have their name taken away of their country. So that didn't mean they stopped living there. That just meant that they were now not even called Judean anymore, by the Romans at least. So Rabbi Akiva said, merriment and frivolity, accustom one to sexual licentiousness. Tradition is offense to the Torah. Tithes, offense to wealth. Vows, offense to abstinence. Offense to wisdom is silence. Now, why is he talking about fences over and over and over again? Why is that? That's the word that's used, siyag, over and over again. So, well, let's first take the first part of this, which is that he's definitely talking about the word erva is, they translate as sexual licentiousness. That means sexual behavior that's prohibited. That's not really a question. What leads to it, some would say, is drinking too much. The translation they translate it as merriment, frivolity. Yeah, having kind of having your inhibitions lowered will lead to, or a custom one, or helps lead to the other stuff. You know, you can argue that. I mean, I don't know, but there's some sense to that. He sets up a situation where he says, if you're engaging in this kind of behavior, it's going to lead to this kind of behavior. And then that leads to his fences. So a fence is a protection, right? It's to protect something. So protecting what you're protecting, you protect with a fence. And so what this does is it stops you from doing things that you would otherwise do, and it protects you from destroying what you're trying to protect. So a fence does a couple of things. Right? A fence stops you from crossing a boundary, if you will, but it also protects what you're trying to protect. So his first part is really about, like, well, if you're going to go in that direction, that's the direction you're going to go. But the fence protects what we're trying to protect. So what are we trying to protect? Well, the first thing he says is we're protecting the Torah. And that phrase was used right from the beginning of Pirke Avot. It talked about putting a fence around the Torah. What the rabbis were engaged in their teachings, they translate the word as Masorah, is tradition. We use the word Masorah, is one of the words that we use in Hebrew for tradition. I'm trying to think if you've heard the word Masorah before, but I mean, there's a organization, their motto is Torah Masorah, Torah and tradition. But I'm trying to think of something that you've heard where there's a printing house that's called Masorah, Orthodox printing house. But Masorah is one of the words we use for tradition. Now, he's meaning more than just tradition. He's talking about the oral tradition. He's talking about the laws that they're engaged in right now, the teachings that they're engaged in now. The rabbis really felt that the laws of the Talmud, laws that aren't in the Torah, they're not in the Torah. But what they do is they help protect us from violating the Torah. So by saying, well, we're going to do this, now again, you can make the argument, yeah, but if you put too many fences up, then no one gets to do anything. But they did to some extent, and they still do in the Orthodox world. If you say to them, well, why don't you do that? Like, why do you do that? It doesn't say in the Torah you're supposed to do that. You say it's a fence around the Torah. So the one that's most obvious when it comes to licentiousness and to erva, to sex,
Nowhere in the Torah does it say a woman has to wear a wig on her head. Nowhere does it say a woman has to wear full-length skirt, dress all the time. It's a fence. They said in order to prevent people from essentially being sexually excited, we're going to put people into a situation where they don't see it. You could say, well, it's not really fair, but that's what a woman has to deal with. The man, the tradition for him, Torah doesn't say anywhere that a man is not allowed to shake a woman's hand. But I don't encourage you to shake a Chabad rabbi's hand if you're a woman, because it's a very uncomfortable moment. They're not being unfriendly at all. But they can't shake your hand. Yeah. Yeah. Doesn't say anywhere he can't touch you, but it prevents that from happening in their mind. So a fence around the Torah, that's what these laws are for them, for some people. But we put our own fences up. I mean, we come up with rules that, we say this is going to prevent us from doing something else.
Civility is.
What do you mean? Civility.
Stopping it? One kind of
Okay. But think about, and then think about,
stop sign. Chaos. It's chaos.
but think about but think about the things that you do that aren't, I mean, you could be arrested if you didn't stop at a stoplight. That's not, you're breaking the law. But think about the things that you do in your life that are not against the law, but you just know that they're good because it stops you from getting to, I mean, like one of the most probably obvious is that, look, there's a lot of reasons why people don't, drink alcohol in every situation that they're in. But one of them is it does lower your inhibitions. That's what he said at the beginning. He didn't quote that again. He didn't have to. He already told you why you got to be careful with it. It's not against the Jewish law. We just talked about Purim. It's not against Jewish law to have fun and to drink a little, but we know that doing that could help us lower our inhibition and get us into a situation where what happens in Vegas, I don't know. Finish that sentence for yourself. But people know that today. You know that. I mean, we all have our own personal fences that we say, look, I'm just not going to get into that situation. I'm just not going to put myself.
One of the things that's a offense for marriage is married people wear wedding bands and they announce to the world, I am married to someone, I am not available. Is that offense?
Yeah, but I'm not wearing. No, I can't. I'm telling you, I wore my wedding ring for the first like 10, 12 years of my marriage. And then I couldn't wear it because my fingers swell up so bad. Like right now they're not, but like if I have salt or I don't know what it is, but like my finger will swell up so much. There were times when I couldn't bend my finger. I mean, sometimes like I look at my hands, I'm like, whose hand is that? Because I can't even squeeze it. But yes, that is an indicator. I think it's partly an indicator for us and it's an indicator for others. Though I will tell you sometimes, some people have said this, Joyce, not to me. Well, yes, to me, but not to me in that way. But some people say that there are people that are attracted to you if you have a ring on. For some people, it also means that like, they're like, you look at it as a challenge.
Oh,
I didn't say it never happened to me, but people have told me that. Like, they haven't told me that. They've told me about that. Let me make it clear. No one said that ring is a challenge to me. No. So I don't anyways, but no, some people do that. They wear a ring. That was actually in a movie. That was an Adam Sandler movie where he would wear a ring just so women would hit on him. But no, it's a weird thing that it should be though. You're right. But that's so tradition, the oral tradition, the laws that the rabbis were coming up with were a fence to protect the Torah. So we don't violate it. So we keep it and we keep it intact so that we don't violate it. So we don't even get into a situation where we say, are we breaking the Torah law? You know, like some would say, like, it doesn't say in the Torah anywhere, we don't mix chicken and milk together. It doesn't say you can't have a chicken sandwich with cheese on it. But some people say it's a fence around the Torah to say, we don't have any meat with dairy, and so we don't have chicken with dairy. It's not really in the Torah, but it kind of protects it by saying we're not having meat and milk together, even if it's chicken meat. So, I mean, there's things like that that we do that we protect it by making sure like we don't violate it, you know? So there's a lot of examples of that in Jewish tradition and in the Talmud. But the next one's an interesting one because it says that tithes are a fence for wealth. And what's interesting is that in Hebrew it's funny because it's a poetic it's a rhyme. It's ma'asarot sayag le'asher or le'asher, which is so ma'asarot and asher. You can look at them in Hebrew; they look almost exactly the same. Asarot and asher. It's the same letters. It's just a sin and a shin. So it sounds almost the same in Hebrew. So asarot are the ma'asarot, the ma'asar, the tithes are the monies that we donate, right?
Mhm.
And they say the donations are a fence for wealth. Now that's a weird one because that sounds a little bit like a prosperity gospel. That the more you donate, the more wealth you'll have. Seems like it almost, right? It almost seems, because it says tithes are a fence to wealth. So if you think about it, how is that like outer protection of giving tithes going to protect your wealth? Well, you know, we don't teach that the more you donate, the more you get back. I mean, I've not heard, I mean, I haven't heard that being taught in a synagogue. It would be nice, but I can't guarantee that for anybody. If they donate to the temple, they're going to get more money back. There are churches that say that to people. It's called the prosperity gospel. It's done a lot. But we don't do that. Not every church does it. And there's most churches don't, but there are some that do. We look at it in a different way, which is that to some extent, your wealth will be determined and will be guarded by the fact that you gave away that money. Why? Because in Judaism, the only money that we really ever have is the money that we gave away. The money that we've donated is the only money that's really ours. The money we've spent on ourselves and on things that we love, that might have given us joy, but that's not the money that is our money forever. That money's squandered. Hillel wrote a great line it's in the Talmud. He told his students, he says, if a man has 1,000 dinars, right, and he gives away 300 of them, how many does he get? He donates 300, he gives to charity, gives to tzedakah. How many dinars does he have? And then, the guy's like, that's a stupid math question. He's got 700 left. He says, no. He says, if he has 700 left, he can spend it on himself. If he's really lucky, he'll make some investments and maybe he'll do well, but eventually he'll spend it. Or in the best case, he'll leave it to his kids. He'll leave it to the next generation, but it's not his. The only money that's ever his is the money that was accounted for him as he gave it, as he donated it from his heart. It's the only money that's the money that lasts forever. That's his legacy. That's the money that he gave to charity. It's the only money. So he said it's only the 300 that he gave to charity. That's the only money that's his. So that's because that becomes our legacy. So that's what we believe when it comes to donations. His last two, though, vows are a fence to abstinence. I'm not sure I love the word abstinence, but what he is definitely talking about is the fact that people made vows, they made an Nedarim, and then that led to them having less of a chance to do the kinds of stuff that he's talking about, which is erva. So I wouldn't say he's talking about complete abstinence, but he's definitely talking about abstaining from things you're not supposed to do. So these are all good things. I mean, I want to make it clear. What he's talking about is not abstinence completely of sex, but really not doing anything that they're not supposed to do. So can vows do that? I guess. He says that people, if they vow that they're not going to do something, then they'll stop themselves from doing what they're essentially it works. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure he's only talking about sex, but that's what they think he's talking about. But yeah, but it could not have anything to do with sex. It could be, I don't want to gamble anymore. So I promise I'm never going to Vegas, or I promise I'm not going to watch football anymore because it leads to that. So yes, it's a contract with yourself. You're making a contract with God. You're saying, I promise I'm not going to do that because it's going to stop me from doing that. So I don't think it's just sexual of nature, but that's the way they translate it. That's what that's kind of what they meant by the word abstinence there. But it could be from abstaining from alcohol. It could be abstaining from other things that could get people into trouble. Could be by the word abstinence, but that's what we usually kind of think about it. At least I do. I hear people saying abstinence. I usually think about it context is sexual, but I guess it doesn't have to be. The last one is an interesting one. This is actually translated in reverse. It's offense to wisdom is silence. I don't know why they did that. It's the same phrase. Oh, actually, you know what? Sorry, it's not. It's not. It does say siagla. It should say shtika is offense. It does. They translated it the way it is in Hebrew. But in the Hebrew, they put the thing you're trying to protect before what you're doing to protect it. So you want wisdom, you want chokhmah, right? Chokhmah is wisdom. And the way to do that is silence. So it's translated the right way. It's just, but that is the way it is in Hebrew. The goal is wisdom. The measure, protective measure, silence. So that's an interesting one too, because it kind of goes against what we usually think, which is the more you talk, the more wisdom you have. That's what we say.
You better listen.
Yeah. I don't know that we.
People think you're stupid and open your mouth and prove it.
Shtikia, shtika, shtuk. To be quiet. Yeah, it doesn't say listening. It says silence. That's what it says. That's what he said. So, of course, that allows for listening. It also, again, allows for people to think, maybe, to actually ponder things in the silence. That's what Rabbi Akiva said. But that's not all he said. He said other stuff. Because he also said, let's look at this. This is a long one. He used to say, beloved is a man, is a human being, for he was created in the image of God. Especially beloved is he, for it was not made known to him that he had been created in the image of God, as it is said, for the image of God he made man. So, well, let's finish it, then we'll go back. Beloved are Israel. So again, first was beloved as a human being. Beloved are Israel, and that they were called children to the all-present. Especially beloved are they For it was made known to them that they are called children of the all-present. As it is said, you are children to the Lord. That's from Deuteronomy. Beloved are Israel, and that a precious vessel was given to them. Especially beloved are they, for it was made known to them that the desirable instrument with which the world had been created was given to them. As it is said, for I give you good instruction, forsake not my teaching. That line from Proverbs. So there's three things mentioned here, right? Again, this kind of rule of three: human beings, Israel, and the Torah. So it's pretty powerful what he says here, because it kind of gives you a little insight into who Akiva was, what his heart, how his heart, what was in his heart. Because we know that he was murdered. We know that he was killed by the Romans. He was murdered in a brutal way. He was tortured and murdered. And yet, his first line is not about, and again, he does have a line about Israel. He has a line about his people. But his first line is about everybody. And so what does he say? He says every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being was created in the image of God. How much more can we be loved than to know that we were in the image of God? We were made like God. Now, there's an interesting line in the Christian Bible. John 3:16, God so loved us that he gave us his only begotten son. It's a pretty powerful line. You see that John 3:16 all over the place, right? Judaism has a slightly different take on it, which again was written around the time. Rabbi Akiva lived around the time that this was being said. So these kinds of sayings were around there. But his saying is not that God loves us because of Jesus or of who we are beyond a human being. Every single human being, regardless of our understanding of this, even if we don't understand it, regardless of what we believe, regardless of if we're the kind of people that would kill you, which they did, that he would have looked at a Roman and said, God loves you. You were created in the image of God. And that's what Akiva taught. That's what he believed. So, and he said, you know, not only did God do that, God told us that in the Torah. God said, you were created in the image of me. And so God not only loves us, but God told us that. God told us that we're created in God's image. So it's one thing to be loved. The Hebrew word is chaviv adam, beloved is man. But even beyond that, right? Beyond that, hiba yetera, even more dear, even more beloved, is the fact that you know that. God told you that. The next section, though, about Israel is that he's, of course, saying that the Jews, that the people of Israel, are God's children. Not one of us, but all of us. It says in Deuteronomy and Devarim, you are children to the Lord. So, I mean, we're all created in the image of God. And of course, he taught, like many of the rabbis taught, that Israel has a special relationship with God as the children of God. I don't know what every human being is. It seems like every human being is also the child of God because they were created by God. But the understanding is that we are literally God's children in that relationship of understanding who created us and who we're responsible for. I don't know. Maybe God is everyone else's grandfather or uncle. But there is an understanding that they're definitely created by God. They're they're in God's image. And therefore, they're a reflection of God. So we have this relationship with God. But notice that what Israel has is the Torah. And the Torah was given to us. And we know that. We know because the book of Proverbs says, I've given you this good thing, right? I've given you this good thing, the Torah-ti, right? My Torah, don't forget it. Al ta'azvu. Torah-ti, my Torah, don't forget it, right? Say translated as don't forsake my teaching, but the word Torah should be in there. But this good thing, I gave it to you, and it's yours. So every human being is in the image of God. The Jewish people have this special relationship with God, but it's because, to some extent, that they have this special gift that was given to them. Yeah, I don't love the word translation there for vessel, but it's a clay, it's an instrument. Can be a vessel, which usually you think of as like a pot or a jar, but it also, in Hebrew, can be any kind of instrument, any kind of tool, right? Doesn't just have to be a pot or a vessel. It's something useful, though. It's something, clay is not just could have used the word treasure. He could have said a treasure. He didn't. He said it's an instrument. Again, they translated it as a vessel, but that assumes, again, that's something that you use. Okay? So Torah is meant to be used. It's meant to be part of what we do. So he also, again, it's a desirable or it's a valuable. Chemda means something of value, something that's beautiful. So, and yeah. So those are wonderful lines, because not only are these great things here, right? Not only these relationships here, not only like every day we can wake up, look at ourselves in the mirror and go, you're creating the image of God. This is a vision of God. We know it. God's actually told us this in the Bible. So that's why these lines are so powerful. And it gives us a glimpse of Rabbi Akiva. According to tradition, Rabbi Akiva was 40 years old when he decided he was going to start studying Torah. He was 40. He was 40 years old. According to tradition, his father was not Jewish. Yeah. According to tradition, his father-in-law kicked him and his wife, the daughter, out of their house, out of his house, out of his estate, because he was a rich guy. He kicked him out because he didn't like Akiva. He thought Akiva was ignorant and was from lower station than he was. And so Rabbi Akiva, according to tradition, was either a shepherd or, again, working menial jobs, decided he was going to start at kindergarten. And he sat with the kids at kindergarten. And then he moved his way up. And finally, by the time he was done studying in the yeshiva, Then he eventually had thousands of students. He said thousands and thousands of students. And according to tradition, again, when he came back to his father-in-law, who didn't recognize him with all his thousands of students, his father-in-law came up to him and said, I disowned my daughter for marrying someone beneath him. What should I do? He knew who he was.
Oh.
And he said, you should forgive her, ask for her forgiveness, and tell her you were wrong, take her back into your heart. And he did. The fact that then that's the way he ended up is one of those stories where you go, wow, that doesn't seem to be the happy ending that we wanted for that story. Yeah. The tradition is that Rabbi Akiva, when he was not yet learned, he was out with the sheep, and he saw at a fountain, at a well, the water had worn down the stone. So he said, if water can wear down a stone, then I'm sure the Torah can have an effect on me. And that's how he came to his study of Torah at a later date. So it reminds us that it's never too late to start studying. It's never too late to start letting the water, wear us, polish us a little bit. So, because you look at water, you're like, how does water wear down stone? But it does over time. It will wear it down. So anyways, that's Rabbi Akiva. And let's read one more, because Rabbi Akiva is not done. Because this one is one of my favorites. Actually, we have two more from him, but this is Rabbi Akiva's. This one we talk about a lot. I often quote it when people ask me, what does Judaism teach about? Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted. And the world is judged with goodness, and everything is in accordance with the preponderance of work. This is a threefold teaching as well. But the first part of it is the part that we can meditate on now. Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna. Those four words are, again, something that we could talk about for the rest of our lives. Everything is foreseen, yet freedom of choice is granted. So people all the time ask me, what does Judaism teach about free will? Do we have free will? Is everything predetermined? So he lays out this paradox for us. Everything is seen. Everything is foreseen. Everything has been determined, yet free will is given. How can those two things both be true? How are both of those things true? Right? You see? This is a tough one because he seems to want it both ways. But people really want to know, is every decision that I make, has that already been scripted? Right? Do I have really any free will? Do I just think I have free will? Has everything already been determined? So think about that for a second. Is everything predetermined? So there are some faiths that teach that everything is predetermined. It's a critical understanding in Islam, is submission to the will of Allah. It's already been determined. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there's not ways that Muslims have understood that differently, and there's different Christian doctrines on predestination and determinism, and there are differences of opinion there. And yet here in rabbinic Judaism, we have this weird both ways kind of statement. And, you know, people will press me on this all the time, because there are times in our lives where we just feel like, oh, this must have been predetermined. Like that, there is no way that anything, like this had nothing to do with my choice. This is just the way it was going to happen. I just don't know. And people, it comes from a kind of to some extent, a fatalism. And I don't know if it's the most important question, but it's one of the most important questions that we grapple with as conscious beings, is whether or not the decisions that we make are our decisions that we actually had a choice in.
And that plane that crashed and you weren't on it, was supposed to be.
Yes, so you would, in that case, you'd probably feel like it was determined that I wouldn't. That doesn't help me with the person who got my seat, right? Right? I'm not saying that jokingly, but you know, somebody else's, that was somebody else's bad luck. But yeah, people use that. Yes, people absolutely look at it as that must have not been my fate. That's a dramatic version of that, but we all have versions of that. And it oftentimes happens when we either survive something or we get something that we were told, like, oh my gosh, I can't catch a break. Like this must have been somebody's, this must have been God's or something. This must have been, I had no choice. I mean, I had nothing I did. So
More like making good choices. Should I steal? Should I not steal, or should I whatever,
yes,
Simple stuff, not coincidental stuff that I missed the flight and that flight crashed.
so what do you think about those?
I think that
Has to do with stealing,
I'm not just.
No, but she's saying choices, the choices we make. Like if we make a choice to steal, we make a choice to do something bad, or make a choice to something, that's our free will, that's our choice. There, by the way, is gosh, I was just discussing it with somebody recently. There was an article about this in like the Atlantic or some magazine. It's actually a Jewish guy. He's just wrote a book about the fact that like those decisions that you think you're making, you're not making them.
predetermined.
It's predetermined by who you are, by your genetics, by your wiring. Your wiring is predetermined. You almost can't do anything other than those decisions. Which then begs the question, are people who commit crimes doing something wrong? Because that's the way they were wired. They can't do anything else. I mean, there's an argument for that in criminal, in discussions about this in criminal psychology, that people are wired that way. So they're not really, I mean, it doesn't mean you don't punish them or arrest them or whatever. So I'm going to argue that you have to arrest them ahead of time so that they don't hurt anybody. But if people are wired that way, there's nothing really you could do. So there is a theory, or there's as we know more about genetics and we know more about brain physiology, that we are wired that way. That there is, just want you to know that this is a big discussion amongst people who are studying the brain. But this idea that perhaps the decisions that we make are not entirely our decisions is one that I use this as the example. I never was going to play in the NBA, no matter what. It doesn't matter how much I practiced. I just physically could not play basketball. I don't have the physical dimensions to play. It was not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So no matter what I would have wanted to do, that wasn't going to happen. So the reality is that wasn't happening. That wasn't going to happen. There's other things too that were not going to happen, but that one was one. So there's certain things that my DNA, where I was born, all those kinds of things are gonna go into this that was not really my decision. It was just the way I was born. This is what happened. But there is a whole lot of freedom that I do have. Like most of my life seems to be my choice. Now, until I got married, Mike said, that's a Valentine's Day commentary. I will say that's not exactly what he's saying, because he's saying it's all foreseen. It's all been seen. By the way, that doesn't mean that it's all been, well, some could argue that it's all been planned out, but foreseen also means that to some extent that it can be calculated, it can be predicted, or that outcome was there. But that outcome wasn't necessarily the only outcome that I had. I believe this. When people ask me, well, what do you believe? I believe that yes, our choices are almost infinite, but they're not infinite. So to some extent, there's always a boundary. There's a boundary of the reality of what you can do, right? There's only so much you can do. And there's also a reality that we are all going to die. The destiny of us to die is there. Our life will come to an end at a certain point. That finality has all been foreseen. I mean, that might be the most important thing is that will happen. When that happens or how that happens, we might have some control over it. But even if we don't, and some would say, well, then there's the illusion that you have free will. I understand it a little bit differently. And I've kind of like, what I've tried to wrap my head around is this idea that you and I don't really spend a lot of time, I hope we don't spend too much time, calculating the odds of what I'm going to do. What is the probability that what I do is what I should do or what I can do? I mean, sometimes we just have to make a decision. You just have to say, well, this is what I have to do now. I mean, there are people who literally sit there and go, I don't know what to eat for dinner tonight. I can't figure out what to eat. That decision is overwhelming for me. At some point, a human being has to make a decision. But there are people who get paralyzed by decisions, right? So there are people who this is not an easy thing, right? The choices are hard. And he says, Reshut, the choice is given to us. It's given to us. So God has given us the ability, and to go back to what Glory said, to make good choices or bad choices, that has been given to us. So the way I look at it is that our life is like a tree that branches off in millions of directions. That tree exists. That tree to some extent already exists. But if you're going to follow one of those branches and you're going to follow it to the leaf at the end of one tree, there were a whole lot of ways to get to that point. I could have wound up there. I could have wound up there. I could have wound up all different places, lots of different places I could have wound up. But the tree itself already exists. And imagine that with billions of choices, with literally almost an infinite amount of choices. That's what our lives are like. So the interesting thing is that where we find ourselves at the end, or like if we were a bug climbing up our tree, that end that you got to could have been almost infinite amount of places. But the tree itself is closed. It's a closed loop. It doesn't go everywhere. It doesn't go completely outside of, there is an end to it. And to some extent, I believe that God is the totality of all of our possibilities. So God is the composition of all of those possibilities. So the weird thing is we're getting to the point where we could actually maybe predict those things. We could actually see those things play out. In the future, it's possible that our consciousness will be tied to something that will allow us to see all those different things to play out. So even to have an imagination about that, and the fact that we can compute that or even visualize that is kind of amazing, because our ancestors wouldn't have been able to necessarily play that out. But if you could see yourself Maybe you have to have the Apple Vision goggles to do that. But if you could actually see yourself in a reality that you could have had, would you want to see that? But could you actually see those different realities? And they already, to some extent, they could already exist. So that's the thing that I think, I like to think in a way that we're actually understanding this a little bit more, which is that, yeah, to some extent, there's a closed amount of choices. Yeah,
If this happens.
Yeah.
Then do this, but if this happens, then do that.
yeah,
That's what I used to do in programs.
yeah. And so it branches off into lots of trees, lots of directions, right? But at the end of the day, there is a closed amount of choices in the program, so to speak. There's only so many different choices you can go down. So I think that that's kind of what it means, you know, that the choices are somewhat limited. There is a limit to them, but it's almost none. And so for the most part, we have a tremendous amount of free will. It's almost, again, an overwhelming amount of free will. The amount of choices that we have every day is amazing. And I used to tell people, you know, look, I think about it a lot. When I used to visit people in prison, I would tell them, look, your choices are real small. Like your choice of what you're going to do today. I mean, that's the problem with being in prison. I mean, your choices are small. You're not in prison, you've got a lot more choices, but you still have a lot of choices. And free will, to some extent, the extent that we can actually control the decisions that we make and saying, hey, today I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You want that to be as broad as possible to some extent. You know, freedom, well, the great thing about freedom, and that's why, you know, it's translated as freedom of choice. Freedom is a great thing that we want to have. To some extent, I always tell people this. The only thing that wealth really gives you, I think, is freedom. More freedom. Very important.
Choice.
Yeah.
Money
The
can
wealth
buy you love.
can't, but it can allow you to have more freedom. And that's, to me, the only real value to it. The only real value to it is your opportunities. The opportunities that you have, they expand. So when people say, well, why should I want to have money? I don't know. Money by itself doesn't mean anything, but it can give you more freedom. It can give you the opportunity to say, hey, I now have the opportunity to do this or that. I don't have, like, if I have so much money, my choices are limited, but if I have a little bit more money, my choices expand. And to me, that's what it really comes down to. It comes down to how much freedom you have. And I do think it's important. I mean, freedom, I probably obsess about it because I'm an American, but we do want to make sure that people have freedom. I used to tell my kids, I said, you know, look, what you want to do is have the opportunities. You just don't want to close yourself off from the opportunities. Doesn't mean you can't do everything, but you don't want to close off your opportunities. You want to put yourself in a situation. So I tell people, you know, you do well in school. Why do you do well in school? Because the better you do, the more choices you'll have. It's not that you can only pick one college, but pick as many pick from many as you can. That's to me, you know, that's to me the value of, like, you know, when you have that done well in school, you have those opportunities. It doesn't matter. You just had more choices. So I do think that this is important. And again, unfortunately, as I said, for some people, it's paralyzing, but I think it's a really important issue. The idea that, okay, fine, I'm not going to argue with you. To some extent, there's predestination. Stuff is predetermined. We're all going to finally finish our lives. At the end, there'll be an end, right? It's predetermined. Doesn't mean that in the meantime, there's not a whole lot of choice. So I love that. I don't know. We're getting closer. You want a triptych?
I'll rep you a program.
John wants the triptych. I actually do believe that we're going to, if we really want to harness some of our ingenuity, it'll be to help ourselves plan better. So people will eventually, there will be AI, of course, and there'll be people who also are part of this, but people will literally, there'll be a version of consultants that will help you better determine your roadmap based on where you are now and what you have and what you can do. There'll be people who will help you better navigate those choices. I do believe that there'll be like a like a AAA where you'll be able to go. Look, to some extent, that's what, a therapist does that to some extent. I mean, a person who's really helping you helps you by knowing you, be able to tell you based on who you are and based on your personality and based on, your skills and your challenges, that this is going to be some help for you. Maybe this is the path you should be taking. So not to say you can't go down that path, but maybe, this is what's going to happen if you go down that path. But therapists oftentimes do that. I mean, I do that to some extent. I mean, sometimes my job as a rabbi, I think if I have any job of getting in the weeds with people today, it's with that. I mean, people don't come to me and say, who should I marry? But there are people who come to me, saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, or I'm thinking of doing that. And if I, look, if I don't know the person very well, I'm very, it's very hard for me to say, but if I know the person better and I know their strengths and weaknesses, I could say, hey, that's a good, that's probably better choice than that. But I do think that there are people eventually that will, have a little bit of they'll have, maybe they'll have, a profile on maybe your DNA, maybe your, what kind of medications you're taking, what kind of opportunities you've had, and can kind of start crunching the numbers and punch up some suggestions. Now, some people aren't going to like that. I know some people are going to say, I don't want computer or somebody helping me with, but why not? I mean, look, we're going to have, we take the information that we have and hopefully we use it. I mean, I would love to have more help with useful information, but it is something interesting to think about how we use our freedom, how we use our choices, and the fact that we have a tremendous amount of choice, and it's given. It's given to us to some extent. He's saying those choices are given by God, and the foreseen is by God. And technically, if God is all knowing, God knows what the outcomes are going to be, so it is foreseen, but it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of choice. So he says both. The other two parts of it, which are very important too, and they're beautiful too, and they're kind of in the line of Akiva, who must have been a really special person. He said, the world is judged by goodness, right? The world is judged by goodness, which means that God errs on the side of goodness, right? God is essentially trying to find the good in the world, right? God is not trying to destroy the world out of anger or out of, look at how bad the world is. The word nidon, the deen, the judgment of God here is good. God's goal is for it to be judged good. So when people say, well, God's just going to destroy the world, God's angry at the world, he just said, no, God is not angry at the world. God is looking at us with goodness. God's not looking to punish us. God is judging ha'olam, the world, with goodness. Okay? And his last part, this is a weird translation, but I guess hopefully it gets the point across. Hakol means everything, right? Now the last part, lefi rov ha'maaseh, is really saying our deeds, our works, things we do, is what creates the reality that we have. And so you and I can think, well, it's what we were thinking, it's what we were studying, it's what we're praying. He says, no, it's really through the things that we do. And it's a reminder, as we've read in the previous week and the week before, when the rabbis say, yeah, study is really important, but you gotta do work. And that the word ma'aseh means works. It means doing things. It's doing things. So in the end of the day, it's not how much you study and it's not how much you know, but what you do. So that was his threefold teaching, which covers the metaphysics, the big picture, right? You know, how do we approach the world? How do we understand, to some extent, God's judgment on a day-to-day basis? Which, by the way, if you're a rabbi, if you're a judge yourself, you better be following in that way, right? You better be judging people according to goodness as well. The balance, the idea is we're trying to get to goodness, not punishment, but to goodness, not anger, but tov. And the last one is that it's the actions that really count. So pretty powerful stuff from Rabbi Akiva. There's one more. And this is a long one. Well, it's not as long as the previous one, as the, whatever the one we read first, or before. But let's look at this one. It's the heavy duty one too. Gosh, the older I get, the harder it is to read this. He used to say, everything is given against a pledge, and a net is spread out over the living. The store is open and the storekeeper allows credit, but the ledger is open and the hand writes. And whoever wishes to borrow may come and borrow, but the collectors go around regularly, every day, and exact dues from man, either with his consent or without his consent. And they have that on which they can rely in their claims, seeing that the judgment is a righteous judgment and everything is prepared for the banquet. Now, clearly, he's not talking about storekeepers. He's not talking about a person going about their day-to-day life, or going to a party, or going to a dinner. That's not what he's talking about. You know what the banquet is. It's the world to come. It's the world to come. The Seudah, the party, is the world to come. So, what he just laid out is and again, you've read Rabbi Akiva already now, a few lines. This is a guy who likes human beings. He likes people. He wants people to be good. He thinks people can be good. But he also reminds us that the world we live in is a tough world. It's a tough world. And to some extent, the world we live in is open to lots of possibilities. Lots of things can happen. And to some extent, we're going to die. The net is spread out over the living, right? The net's there. That's not a net for protection. That's the net that we're all walking around in this world knowing that at some point the net picks us up. So it's dark in a way, obviously, because he's saying we're all going to die. Everything is given against the pledge, right? You're here, and your time here, to some extent, is a gift. And it's going to be called in at some point. Your life is going to be called in. And what did you do at that time? Right? What did you do with that time? Right? You can do whatever you want with that time. You can do whatever you want with the days you've been given, with the gifts you've been given. But you're going to pay for it. And one day there is going to be an accounting. There is going to be an accounting. So what did you do with that time? You know, what did you do with it? The collectors go around regularly every day and exact dues from the man, right? Either with his consent or without his consent. It doesn't matter whether you like it. Another day passed. Another day's gone.
I wonder if interest is paid can override things you wish you hadn't done or not done.
All we know, I don't know. He's telling you, he just came by to tell you that day's up, you know? The dues are gone. You paid for this day. So, I mean, he's comparing everything to what goes on in business
When was this written?
2,000 years ago.
Everything's 2,000 years. Do we have a year?
130, 125, 130 with a common era, 1900 years ago. So this guy was maybe he was a farmer, maybe he, was a herdsman, maybe he had something like that, but everybody understood what that meant. Every day, you and I don't know how many days we have. We don't exactly know what we don't know what our account is exactly, but there is a fixed amount of days you have. And it's been given to you. He says everything is given against the pledge. Your voice, your time here, your life. Every day they come by and they collect.
Are you saying then that how long you're going to live has already been predetermined?
Well, he's saying it doesn't matter how long you live. He's not saying you're going to live a fixed amount of time. And every one of those days that you've been given is to some extent not yours. God gave it to you. You're living on borrowed time. Yeah, we still use that phrase, right? You're living on borrowed time. But when we say it, we normally mean the person had a heart attack or they had they had a kidney transplant. They're living on borrowed time, right? That's what we say. We say it all the time, but we only mean it for somebody whose health is in a precarious situation. He's saying every human being that was ever born and ever will be born is on borrowed time. So the life that we have is a gift from God, but to some extent, it's not ours. It's been given to us. And what are we going to do with that time? Because what happens is every day they come back, the time gets collected, the day is over, gets collected, and it's gone. And it's gone. The dues were exacted. They came and collected.
You know what's interesting? The words are in a different language. They're written a long time ago when universally probably life was much harder for the majority of people. It's still tough for a lot of folks, but for a lot of folks, right, it's not as tough, but the words are still, the meaning is still, you might have different widgets in your life, cars, whatever your toys are, whatever. It's interesting, man.
It's interesting that, and as I said, that's why it gets harder. It gets harder every time I read this and every time, I think about my own mortality. I think about the fact that he said, your every day it's a gift. And did I do what I should have done today? Because, there's going to be accounting for it. So the person that lent us the time, which is God, is going to call us to account for this. Now he says the judgment is a righteous judgment. He says the deen is emet. It is, well, I wouldn't say it's righteous, by the way. You know what the word emet means? Truth. Doesn't mean tzedek is righteous. Emet is truth. So I'd actually say the judgment is a truthful judgment, which is you can't lie. God knows what you did. The emet, it's emes, man. It's the deen is what it is because it's what it was. There's no, it's not what it was. God knows. This is not going to be, well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, depending on your angle. He said what it was. But he also says at the end, there's going to be a good judge. So your judgment is going to be true. It's not good, it's true. So that's more serious, by the way. It doesn't mean it's going to be, but it also means the banquet, the real banquet, the payout is in the world to come.
Getting off the subject. You have two babies, 14 days old, with the same disease. One goes through, they both go through surgery, one lives and one dies.
Yeah. So why why does one live and one die? He's not, it's interesting because, Mike's saying, well, how is it predetermined that a baby lives and another baby doesn't, why does one live? Yeah. So he's not talking, Akiva, at least when he's talking about, free will, he's not talking about babies that die. He isn't. No, I know, but what he is saying is that adults who have consciousness, who have an understanding of the world around them, need to understand that what they're doing right now has consequence, and that there's a finite time. We don't know what it is. He's not saying, well, if you do this, it's going to be better. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say you're going to live a longer time. He says they're coming, that every day it's being collected. Every day that it's gone. You've paid the dues on that, in the fact that there's another day gone. But yeah, it doesn't deal with like, why did someone die in that moment? I'm trying to think if there's anything in here that has to do with like not having that happen. I don't think anything does. Yeah.
He used to say,
Yeah.
so that's past tense. So
Well,
it's present.
yeah, I understand, but he said it because there's a recognition that all these guys are gone. But he used to say is also, he was, sometimes it's translated as he was accustomed to saying, or this is what he used to say, which is, but the language that way,
Word should be removed. Everything is given against the flood.
okay, but every one of the lines that doesn't start with, if it's a continuation, it will say, he would say. I would actually not even say he used to say, he would say, is the way it should be translated. Hu haya omer. Omer isn't even past tense. Omer is he says. When he would say, that's almost what it has to be translated as. We don't have a good, so to some extent, the language isn't even, we don't have an English translation that gives us that kind of present tense to this, because it really is a present tense. He would say, or he says, or this is what he says. That's really the way, this is what he says. This is why the Talmud is really so much more powerful, is because the sayings last as if he said it to you right now. And the translation actually is a bad translation, because there's really no really great way of translating it. Let me just see if if I go to one of the other translations, if they translate, let me just see if there's a translation that would be different on this. Here's a different one. Let's look. He was wont to say, sprach immer. In German, no. Let's see, any other? No, there's only two English, or no, it says there's four, but he was wont to say, or he would say, he used to say. So I said he would say. He would say. Yeah, I think he would say actually is even more present tense that. But you understand what I'm saying. The phrasing of he was wont to say, this is the kind of thing he would say. This is what he says. But that gives you more of it, like he didn't say it because he doesn't say it anymore. This is what these are his sayings. So yes, there is an understanding that he's gone now. But it's interesting, again, that he reminds us in very real terms that we can understand. And as John pointed out, even though we don't exactly have the same kinds of ways of running an economy now, we all know what it means to owe money. We all know what it means to make a pledge. And again, the image that we have here, which is one of, at some point it's going to be all over. But guess what? Everything is prepared for the banquet. Hakol metukan. Hakol, everything is being prepared for that banquet. So even though it's kind of scary, even though it's kind of dark to think that we're living on borrowed time, there's a point to it, which is, first of all, make that time count, right? Make sure you're spending that time wisely. But of course, the real party is yet to come. So you can understand why a guy like that could go off to be murdered and say, I'm okay. Gonna be okay. Because he believed that.
Getting there might not be a great.
Man. Well, you know, they gave him several options before he died to recant, to say he'd stop teaching, stop advocating for Jewish self-autonomy, and he kept refusing it. Supposedly, some of his students and some of the Romans that even themselves were admirers of him. So, as they pulled the flesh off of his body, you know, he's still telling him to stop, you know, and he's like, so, you know, how are you still alive? Right? And at dawn, he looked up at the sun as it was coming up over Caesarea. As I've taken people to Caesarea and told them the story of Akiva, that when Caesarea, again on the coast, you know, you're looking at the sunrise or sunset, but again, it's beautiful to see the sun over the water. He said, I've always wanted to say the Shema with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my might. Never been able to do that until now. And as he said the Shema the morning he died. And that's where we have the tradition too of saying the Shema as we pass. Because he said, I wanted to say it with every fiber of my being. So that's how he said, that's the way I'm going to go out. They said the Shema and he died. So even in his last moment, he was trying to be close to God and also to fulfill a mitzvah, but he was looking forward to the banquet. So, wow, this is a long one, right? This is Eleazar ben Azariah, one of his colleagues. This is what he said. You'll like this one. And by the way, we may not get much past Eleazar ben Azariah tonight, but this has got a lot. We'll see.
It's pretty heavy.
It's pretty heavy. Look, it doesn't end. It doesn't end with it doesn't end there too with you know, because you know, Rabbi Akiva, I always tell people who got grossed out by watching the Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson's movie, was like, yeah, but there's a Rabbi Akiva story that's just as brutal, and I don't want to see that either, by the way. But there was that, you know, we know that there were Jews that were martyred. There's a famous scene, by the way, too, that I've talked about. I've told this story before. That should be in a movie, or I'm going to put it in your head as a movie. But you know, and we've discussed this, Mike's heard this a dozen times, that when Moses died, Moses was given that special gift of being able to see the whole land of Israel. And according to the Midrash, according to our understanding, he was also given not just a view of the land of Israel, but the Jewish people. That he got to see, Moses got to see the Jewish people. And he got to see highlights of Jewish history. And so there's a Midrash that Moses gets to see Rabbi Akiva teaching the Torah in the academy. And he listening to Akiva, who again, according to tradition, became one of the great teachers and could like expound lessons on a dot on the Torah. A dot, a vowel would give him an opportunity to teach a teaching. So Moses is watching Rabbi Akiva teach the Torah. And again, Rabbi Akiva lived 1,500 years after him. But he says, you know, there was human evolution or human progress. But Moses says to God, why did you give the Torah through me? This guy is teaching the Torah. I don't understand what he's teaching. I can't figure out what he's teaching on what you told me. He's now teaching stuff that I can't even comprehend. Right? So why didn't you give him the Torah? I didn't deserve to be the carrier of the Torah. He deserves it. He understands it a lot better than I do. So God says to him, you don't understand my ways. You don't understand why I do the things I do. So Moses says to God, I want to see what happens to this guy, because this guy surely must have had a great life. And so God shows him Rabbi Akiva being tortured to death. And again, remember, this is our midrash. This is what the rabbis wrote. That Moses turns to God and says, what? This is the Torah and this is his reward? This is his Torah and this is his reward. This is how he's being paid back? And God says to him, you don't understand my ways. So, obviously, Moses didn't understand God's ways, and the rabbis didn't understand God's ways. So, the fact that we don't understand God's ways thousands of years ago, that's also something that the rabbis were free to admit. That they didn't understand it. Moses didn't understand it. They didn't understand it. We don't understand it. So a world that kind of stuff happens, they didn't understand it. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, where there is no Torah, there is no right conduct. Where there is no right conduct, there is no Torah. Where there is no wisdom, there is no fear of God. Where there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom. Where there is no understanding, there is no knowledge. Where there is no knowledge, there is no understanding. Where there is no bread, there is no Torah. Where there is no Torah, there is no bread. Let's pause there. The next part could be a new paragraph. So the first part of this, because then it says he used to say, same phrase, hu haya omer, which is kind of like a new idea. So the first part, which goes to right here, hu haya omer. It's the way the phrase he used to say. So this first part, I'm going to go back and sometimes show you on a couple of the phrases, I'm going to show you the Hebrew. Now, you could say, well, this is kind of silly. I mean, it's nice, it's powerful and everything, but he just flipped everything. That's all he did. But he didn't, because there is a truth in every one of these sayings that he just gave us, that both of them apply. So at the beginning, when he says, Ein Torah, Ein derech eretz. So the phrase, you know what Torah means, no Torah, there's no Torah, right? But he says, if there's no Torah, there's no derech eretz, there's no ethical, derech eretz means the ways of the land. But it literally is, there is no ethical behavior. That's another way of they translate it as right conduct. Okay, I guess. I mean, it's not bad, not a horrible translation, but it's really, it's really ethical. It's ethical decisions. It's not a way, there's no way to live like that. So he's saying if you don't have Torah, you don't have that. But he also says, and again, this isn't just a flip, he's also telling you if you don't have derech eretz, if you don't have ethical behavior, you won't have Torah either. So that means that even if you think you're going to have Torah, if you don't have an environment where people are treating themselves ethically, you won't have Torah. And so that's, the first one's a warning to people that you can't have a world where you're going to expect there to be ethical behavior if there isn't Torah. There's no Torah there, you're probably not going to have that. Now, again, it's not like they didn't have laws back then. They had Roman laws and they had other laws, and there were places where there was certain cities where there were certain rules. It's not like they didn't have rules, but they understood that the Torah led to ethical behavior. It's not just following rules. It's that you actually have ethical behavior. But they're also telling us that if you have a situation, even if you're studying Torah, but there isn't ethical behavior, the Torah is not going to flourish in that area. So if you are trying to, well, you say, well, we're all studying Torah here, but you're not acting ethically, the Torah is not going to find a place in that environment. If it's not an ethical place, the Torah will not be taught effectively there. So it's a warning. The first one's kind of a warning for Jews not to be in a place where there's no Torah. But the other part is really a warning for Jews who think just because you're studying Torah, that there's going to be ethical behavior there. You have to have ethical behavior too. Now, again, one leads to the other, and there's a circle and everything like that, but you can't have one without the other, either way. You can't have Torah be planted in a place where there's not ethical behavior. It's an important reminder for the more religious communities that if they're not practicing derech eretz, what we call ethical behavior, we still use that phrase in Torah communities. This place doesn't really have derech eretz. It doesn't really have ethical behavior. It may mean that the people are very observant, but they're not treating each other well. They're not treating each other ethically. Which you'd say, well, how could they be doing that? Well, there's obviously a difference just between knowing it and practicing it. The next one, again, as far as wisdom, and then yirah, which is fear or reverence. What's interesting about this is that a lot of times today, especially today, we think that people who are wise are not reverent or God-fearing people. Today, we've turned this into a negative in our world, where people who have reverence or, again, some kind of, theological construct that they have, we see them as weak-minded or feeble-minded because they have that. In our tradition, they're actually, again, completely dependent on each other. That relationship between wisdom and yirah. Again, literally, yirah is reverence or fear. But it's not somebody who's so wise that they're not in fear and have some sense of humility. We actually have to have knowledge in order to have that fear. And then again, if we have that fear, we can have that in a positive way, right? These are cautionary. They're put, if you don't have this, you're not going to have that. So this is cautionary. This is reminding people, you better have both sides, right? The next one is also part of the knowledge and wisdom areas. Bina and da'at. Bina, often translated as discernment or kind of street smarts, emotional intelligence, knowing what kinds of decisions you should make. And da'at is knowledge, intelligence, book smarts. I would translate that today as you don't have street smarts, you're not going to have book smarts. And if you don't have book smarts, you're not going to have street smarts. Now, you could say, well, you could, but do you really have it? Can you really have one and not the other? Can you really have discernment?
I know people that are book smart
And they don't have no street smarts? Yeah, well, it's probably a problem, right? They probably aren't quite as smart as they think they are. Because in essence, again, if you think about it, somebody who's very book smart and doesn't have any street smarts and doesn't have any emotional intelligence and discernment, they're going to make bad decisions. And at some point, they're going to be exposed for not being very smart.
It's like
Those-
someone who is smart, but has no common sense.
Yes, and you have to have both, and you really can't have real intelligence unless you have common sense. You have to have both. Now, those things, they translated it as wisdom, discernment, or what do they translate it as? They translated it as understanding, knowledge. But those phrases, right? Those phrases of chokhmah, bina, and da'at, which again, they also have yirah, that's the fourth thing. There's two couples, yirah and chokhmah, bina, and da'at. But chokhmah, bina, and da'at, we take that chet We take that bet, we take that dalet. If we take those three words, chokhmah, bina, and da'at, which are three forms of knowledge or wisdom, which in Kabbalah are the sfirot, they're the components of God that have to do with knowledge and capacity, intellectual capacity. What if you take those three letters? What do you have? What's the word you have? Oh, interesting. So the word Chabad is actually an acronym for Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. Not so much, again, because those are three words for knowledge. They're actually kinds of three components that we would call, again, we call them the sfirot or emanations of God, 3 of the 10. But what's interesting about them is they are components of consciousness. So Chokhmah is usually translated as wisdom. Bina is usually translated as discernment or understanding. And Da'at is intelligence. But by bringing them all together, we remind ourselves that they're all three are components of making good decisions and living a good life. All of them are important. Wisdom is definitely one that's more experiential, right? But it's one that, again, we definitely admire is wisdom. Sometimes, again, it's almost necessary for that to be of a certain age, but we'll say someone is wise beyond their years, right? Which means that they have some kind of knowledge, experience, or some type of something to share. Their sagacity, which is profound. Bina is definitely more of your understanding or your discernment, your ability to make good choices. Well, I said sometimes we say street smarts, but your ability to navigate decisions and make the right decision. We talked about before about the branches on the tree, to be able to make the better call in that moment. That's discernment. And the last one, knowledge, is really your comprehension and your ability to process information, remember information. We don't see those as necessarily like they're not the same. That's the weird thing. Like they're not. Like in Judaism from 2,000 years ago, from this guy, he's already making distinctions between them. You can say, well, how do we translate them, whatever. He's definitely already giving them independent value. And that's interesting too, because it also shows us, and again, it's not, the Jews weren't the only people who did that. The Greek philosophers were talking about, Aristotle and Plato were talking about different forms of knowledge. And I mean, Jews were not the first people or the only people that did this, but it shows you from an early age, we were understanding that there are different aspects of our intelligence and our knowledge and our wisdom, and that we can't take any of them for granted, and we need to develop all of them. If you say, well, I don't really care, I just want to know everything, then you're missing. You're 1 out of 3. And if you're, I would say, if Judaism values any of those 3 more than the one, what do you think we value the most? Of the 3, which one have you heard of the most? Anybody? Wisdom, discernment, or understanding? Wisdom, understanding, or knowledge? Which one do you think which one do we usually, if we're going to pick one, what do we pick? Yeah. Chokhmah is usually considered to be the one that, like, if you had one, that's an important one. Wisdom's usually considered, as we already heard, part of wisdom, silence, right? But wisdom often takes time, right? It often takes, there's a certain experiential, there's an aspect to that where you had to learn over time. And so, yeah, that's probably the one that we talk about the most. That's the one that we probably are most biased towards. And we use that phrase all the time, a chacham, right? A chacham in Yiddish is a wise person, right? Sometimes it's used as a derogatory way. That person thinks they're a chacham, but they're not, right? That person's a chacham. But it's really meant to be a title, an honorific title. And in Sephardic communities, a chacham was kind of like a rabbi, was like the leader of the community, was like the sage of the community, was a chacham. And that was like the title, the honorific title. Da'at intelligence implies like, you know, the rules and you, it's not always like, it's not always that you follow it, or even if you follow it, knowledge by itself is oftentimes kind of weak. And discernment's really important because again, it's your decision-making. It's your decision-making, but we probably talk about that one the least. Though there are, you know, like, think about where the words pop up. Chacham comes up all the time. Like, even like in the four sons, right? We say the first one is the Chacham, right? The wise son. But the word dati in Hebrew means someone who's very observant, right? A religious person in Israel. We don't say they're religious. We say they're dati. They're knowledgeable, which means they probably, again, are keeping a lot of the laws. But dati is the word that we use for that, and it implies like they know the laws. But and Bina we don't use a lot, but it is not an uncommon name for a woman actually. But there's a lot of people, not a lot, but there's Bina is a Hebrew name or a name that you'll see oftentimes in more religious communities, that Bina is used. Yeah, so Chokhmah was oftentimes also translated at this time as Sophia, which in wisdom, in Greek thought, wisdom was like an aspect of God, Sophia. So that's where the name Sophia comes from. But in Hebrew, we use other words, other names. So those were the phrases that he used. So, yep, we're going to read on here this last part of his teaching. This part's probably the most famous part of the whole line, the whole text. So, the last line almost comes back to, well, it comes back to Torah, right? He said at the beginning, where there's no Torah, there's no right conduct, right? No right conduct, no Torah. Now he says, Ein Kemach, Ein Torah. Ein Torah, Ein Kemach. So this one is often quoted. You can probably guess why. Does anyone want to guess why? Ein Kemach, Ein Torah. Anyone want to guess why we quote that a lot? Actually, this is another one that's been put to music. I can, the melody going in my head.
It's a way of taking in knowledge.
Yep.
But,
Well, what do you think? Let me ask you a question. In our world today, what does the word bread mean?
money.
It meant that then too. Now, yeah, you could say, yeah, where there's no sustenance, where there's no food, there's no Torah, where there's no Torah, there's no sustenance. But yeah, they actually are. This is often quoted in the rabbinical world today, or quoted or used when when synagogues are discussing pay for their rabbis. Show me the money, right? It's getting up on the table and saying, show me the money. No, there's an answer here. Yeah, it's Jerry Maguire, but it's now being used, or it's been used. It's been used in Kemach and Torah, which is the Talmud, which is Rabbi Elazar. Yeah, you got to pay. There's got to be sustenance for the people who are teaching Torah. And so if a synagogue is in a debate or in discussion about, having to pay for a rabbi, the people will come in from the movement or wherever, and they'll say, well, you got to pay in Kemach in Torah. If you don't have sustenance, there's not going to be Torah. Now, of course, the other part's true as well. If you don't have Torah, you're not going to have the other stuff too. You got to have that to have the other stuff. That's a little bit of the prosperity gospel, by the way, if you want. Ain't Torah. If you don't have Torah, you're not going to have the other stuff. But you're not going to have the food part. You're not going to have the money part if you don't have Torah. So you need to have that. you need to have Torah in order to have that. But they're also saying if you don't have a way of paying for people to have Torah, you're not going to have it. You can't have it if there's not a community that's willing to pay to have the Torah being taught. It won't be there. So that is an often quoted one because it's a big issue. It's a big issue because, this to some extent is the rabbinic quandary of it. But look, 2,000 years ago, this wasn't the issue. Wasn't the issue that it is today, because the rabbis weren't supported as professional clergy. They weren't supported that way. They were supported by the community because the community needed to have people, not so much even to study, to teach Torah, but to administer on a legal standpoint the way that the system works. So paying for the academy or paying for a yeshiva or paying for a place which would train rabbis and train people to be knowledgeable in the law meant that there would actually be a legal framework. For people who lived under the Talmudic time, this was their law. This was the way that they functioned on a daily basis. I mean, this was their laws. So this isn't just like, oh, we got to pay the rabbi. Today, that's the way it's used, but it wasn't used in those days as a justification for paying a rabbi, because the system doesn't work unless there's like a structure in place that finances the whole thing. But it wasn't like people said, oh, we have to write out the rabbi a check. It wasn't like that. It wasn't run like that. But there definitely was an understanding that you had to have, there had to be a system, there had to be an infrastructure that would support, in those days, again, more of a legal framework. It was not that they needed a rabbi to lead services. They didn't need a rabbi to lead services. Everyone could lead services. And the structure of teaching Torah and everything else was literally, I hate to say it, but it was much more of a day-to-day issue for people because it was their laws. It was the way that they lived every day. So this isn't like, well, we feel good about it. We like our synagogue. Let's pay to have the synagogue. It wasn't like that. It is definitely used like that today, 100%. That phrase, to some extent, ever since Jewish community in America was established and people had to go around and ask for donations, that's the line that was given. And I've seen it. I've seen it on printed donation requests. Ein kamach, ein Torah. No, there's no bread without Torah, no Torah without bread. I mean, I've seen it. But definitely was used a lot more when people were familiar with the line and where it came from, and they'd read Pirke Avot. But this is really an important idea, which is there has to be a system, there has to be an infrastructure, and how we see that infrastructure. So today, we see it as an infrastructure that teaches, and that, what does our synagogue do? It teaches another generation the Torah. So there'll be another generation of Jews.
Does bread also mean the word of God?
Glory's point of bread being the word of God. Yes, other than the fact that would be the same thing. So it's not the same thing. There is another times, it kind of is. And again, I mean, to some extent, you're right, because if the bread is equal to it or is part of that cycle, then yes, that it leads to that. But there really is an understanding that like the two are in a symbiotic relationship. They're a dependent relationship, that one thing is going to help the other thing, which will then help the other thing. And so there is this understanding that what is that other thing? It's probably more of the physical structure of day-to-day life. May not be just money. It's definitely not just bread. But it is the sustenance of day-to-day life that allows us to do the higher stuff, to do the Torah stuff. But without that, You can't have that. And I'm telling you, that's the phrase that everybody knows of this. If they know that at all. But what happens is it begins with the Torah and then comes back to the Torah. And the stuff in the middle is obviously really great too. Ein Chochmah, Ein Yirah, those are great phrases too. But it really is then on both sides bookended by the Torah. And it's really interestingly, if you think about it, Torah, right conduct, which is really derech eretz. Right conduct, I don't like that translation at all. As I said, maybe it's ethical behavior. I don't even know if ethical behavior, I think that sounds too sophisticated. Derech eretz really is the way you behave, the way you talk to people, the way you act on a day-to-day basis. It's your conduct. That's why I say conduct, but I think it's a fancy word. But derech eretz is the way of the world. Eretz is the land, right? It's the basic behavior. Maybe I'd translate it as basic behavior. Your civility, your goodness to each other. But your day-to-day stuff, that's paralleled with kemach, with flour or bread. By the way, kemach is more flour than bread, by the way. I just want to point out. That's not even a great translation for kemach. It's really flour. I think they translated it as bread because bread means money, and they wanted you to know that. We don't say flour is money, but it's really the building block of bread. Bread is even like a final output. Kemach is the raw flour. That's what the word is. Kemach is the raw flour, which they're to some extent equating with, I think, with derech eretz, which is your day-to-day behavior. Your day-to-day behavior, your flour. Those are like the things, like if you're a basic human being, you need to have those two things. Whether you're Jewish or not, doesn't matter. But Torah, you need both of those. So your day-to-day behavior, your basic elements, your basic behavior, your basic building blocks of life, you need to have Torah. You need to have Torah for that. And without Torah, you're not going to have that. So it's a good reminder, like day-to-day basis, derech eretz and kemach, the Torah is part of each of those. So it is a reminder that we're walking through life. We're definitely thinking about the higher purpose, but we have to have the other day-to-day stuff too. We have to have the day-to-day stuff taken care of. That's flour, that's derech eretz. So all that's good stuff in the middle, wisdom, fear of God, understanding, knowledge, all those stuff, that's all real important too, and they're all interdependent. But there's this kind of like basic understanding of it that is, and I don't know that I've ever seen that until just now, is the fact that the Torah is on both sides of it. Maybe I knew that, but I never really thought about the fact, maybe it was partly because of what Glory said, to literally look at it. And I didn't like, I did know that kemach is flour and bread is not necessarily a translation, but I really do think that flour and right conduct, derech eretz, are really good juxtaposition. They're really good as comparisons to like what we need in life, because those are basic things you need, just basic stuff. But Torah works with both things. So that's where we're going to finish today. We're not going to finish his Rabbi Elazar's text because that goes on. We'll read his next part. He used to say, and then we're almost done with the chapter, but that's where we're at. So it was Ash Wednesday today.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
No.
Okay. Well, I didn't see anyone with ash on their head today, so I figured, but you might have seen it. But yeah, it's Ash Wednesday, which, by the way, it just makes me feel weird because Passover is so far away. I'm not even thinking about it. But as I told you, Passover and Easter are about a month apart this year. So we're not going to be in the same world as our Christian friends who are celebrating Easter. They wanted to have it on your birthday. You're bragging now about your Passover birthday. No, I know. But you're not going to eat cake anyways. So, but yes, Passover should have been, or Easter should have been at Passover, but it's not. Because of the church 2,000 years ago deciding that they don't want to be too Jewish. It is, but it's not, but it should be around Passover should be around Easter,
Right,
not
right.
Purim, but yes. Yes, it's because, again, as I said, Easter is the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, the full moon of the vernal equinox. It just so has to happen that this year they got just under it. By the way, partly because, well, it still would have happened anyways, but the vernal equinox is the 19th this year. It's usually the 20th, but because of leap day, we have it on March 19th. So around the corner will be the springtime, everybody. It's in the air. We'll see you
Okay.
tomorrow night.
Forget about
Tomorrow night, I didn't forget, Lazy Dogs. Tomorrow night is Lazy Dogs. And then Friday night is Rick and Addie with a special set of songs. No, it's regular. See everybody soon. If you don't live nearby, we'll miss seeing you at Lazy Dog or at services. But we'll see you soon, everybody. Take care. Bye,
Goodbye,
everybody.
thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Rick.
thanks, Rabbi.
Bye.
Good night.
Cheryl, my David.